at my son's establishment with and Gemma's, his fiance. So, and uh, say hello, Gemma. Hello to the world. She's relaxing listening to stories. So there, there we go.
I
And
find it ironic that you're next to a Christmas tree, not in your Christmas regale.
well, I had my Well, it's just that
I know, I
I,
know.
I suddenly, well, to tell you the truth, I hadn't actually organised anyone for this Friday. So Omar said, "Is there a program?" And I said, "Yes, of course." So I hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas, wherever you are, and I certainly did. I had one with my partner, and then I came up to eat all my children's food, um, so and be pampered. Uh, so, but the story, and I did some a few weeks ago, and I can't remember what I did. So I think I'm going to start off with a gypsy version of Cinderella, um, which was collected in 2015 from an English Romany woman, not by me, uh, although I'm 400 years old. Um, and it's Mossy Coat. It's one of 300, so over 300 Cinderella stories. And for the folklorists amongst you and the budding folklorists amongst our young listeners, there are over 300 versions of Cinderella, and we used to think the earliest one was from ancient China, from about 600 AD, but it turns out that there was from about 28 BC. There was one from ancient Egypt, and that's as far as we know. Of course, it could go back even further than ancient Egypt, but the but the ancient Egypt is when we begin to actually get some kind of history. Uh, anyway, so it traveled. So it traveled across from probably this version. The closing it probably from northern India with the Dom and the Rom, and and then it's been no. There's no cultural purity with stories. They travel. Stories travel in every land they travel through. They pick up bits and pieces. It's like Teflon. Um, so. So this is when it arrives here and is adopted by the gypsy woman. And her name's Mossy Coat in this story. And it's from way back in time when my hair was dark and my beard was ginger and all my teeth were my own. And there was a girl called Mossy Coat. She was the most beautiful, beautiful. And Babasi's just put up that stories don't need passports. And neither should any of us. But there's So she was the most beautiful girl in the village. Everyone wanted to marry her, including the local tinker, the man that went from door to door selling and mending things. And every night he would bring her presents, sometimes a necklace, sometimes a bracelet, occasionally earrings. She loved the presents, but she didn't want to marry the man. So she went up to Mum, Mum, love the presents, don't want to marry the man. Mum said, don't worry about it. I'm making this petticoat. Now, for the modern day children, sometimes I have to explain what a petticoat is. It's a sort of you wear it under the skirt or the dress, and and you might wear several of them if it's a really cold winter. It was before women could wear trousers to work, so they had to have a few layers on, and then it was also to make your dress or your skirt look full, which is another expression that makes no sense. It means to make it stand out. So, having got that out of the way, the explanation for these obscure uh, uh, ancient things, well, it wasn't ancient, everyone wore them when I was growing up. Anyway, I'm making this petticoat. When it is finished, all our troubles will be over. In the meantime, telling me you can't marry him until he brings you a dress of white satin, gold leaves on it the size of a man's hand, and it must fit perfectly. Which she ran down to, she said, ran down to Tinker and said, my mum says Mum says, if you can't, I can't marry you unless you bring me a dress of white satin, gold leaves on the size of a man's hand, and it must fit perfectly. Well, he took a measure and off he went. And a week later, he's back, and what did he have but a dress of white satin, gold leaves on the size of a man's hand, and it fitted perfectly. Mum, don't worry, she said. I've nearly finished the petticoat. In the meantime, you tell him you can't marry him until he brings you a dress of silk, the colour of the birds of the sky, and it must fit perfectly. Well, when that's what my mum says, can't marry until you bring me a dress of silk, colour of the bird of the sky, and it must fit perfectly. Well, once more he went off, and once more he came back, and this time he had a dress of silk, colour of the birds of the sky, and it fitted perfectly. Mum, don't worry, she said. I've nearly finished the petticoat. In the meantime, tell him you can't marry him until he brings you a pair of silver slippers, and they must be neither too big or too small. They must fit perfectly. Correct, that's it. My mum says, can't marry you till you bring me a pair of silver slippers, neither too big or too small. They must fit perfectly. Well, he looked at her 3-inch feet and off he went. And a week later he's back, and what did he have but a pair of silver slippers, neither too big or too small. They fitted perfectly. Mum, don't worry, she said. Tell him if he meets you outside the church at 10 o'clock tomorrow, you'll be married. Well, Mum hadn't steered her wrong yet, but she was a bit worried now. She went back downstairs. Me mum says, if you meet me outside the church at 10 o'clock tomorrow, we'll be married. Well, he's happy, he's laughing, he's doing cartwheels down the street. Meanwhile, she's back upstairs. Mum, what have you done to me? Don't worry, she said. I've finished the petticoat. And it wasn't any ordinary petticoat, it was a petticoat of moss with gold threads running through it, and it would take her anywhere she wanted. And Mum knew a thing or two about the future. Told her to put on a mossy petticoat. Over the top it, she put her dirtiest, grottiest working clothes. She took the best clothes and put them in a bundle under her arm and wished herself 100 miles away. And she was to put her best clothes under her arm and wish herself 100 miles away. When she got there, she was to walk till she came to a big house. She was to knock on the front door and ask for a job. Well, just like you all would sitting in your houses or your flats or wherever you happen to be, wherever you happen to be right now, she did exactly what her mother said. She put on a mossy petticoat. Over the top of it, she put her dirtiest, grottiest working clothes, took her best clothes, put them in a bundle under her arm, and wished herself 100 miles away. When she got there, she walked till she came to a big house. She knocked on the front door. It was opened by the mistress. And what do you want? Said the mistress. Like a job, said Mossycoat. And what can you do? Said the mistress. I'm the best cook in the world, said Mossycoat. I've already got a cook, said the mistress. I tell you what, you can be the undercook, the cook's assistant. And she took her down and introduced her to all the other servants. Well, in those days, the best job in the house was the cook's. And the second best, well, apart from the butler, that is, and probably the cook got more perks anyway. And the second best was the undercook. And no way were they going to let this little traveling girl come in off the street and take the second best job in the kitchen. So as soon as the mistress was out the way, they gave all the nasty jobs to do, cleaning out the fireplace, cleaning the grease from the pan. They wouldn't even let her wash, and she soon had dirt from the tip of her toes to the tip of her nose. Well, life carried on like this for some time until news came of a great dance. And it was to last 3 nights. And the first night, the mistress invited her up to a room. All the other servants thought she was going to get the sack. She was going to lose her job. When she got up there, the mistress said, Mossycoat, would you like to come to dance from thyself, the master, and our son? Mossycoat said, thank you kindly, ma'am, but look at the state of me. If I sat in your fine carriage, I'd make the seats all greasy and nasty and disgusting. And if any fine gentleman sat next to me, I'd make his silk suit all greasy and nasty. Thank you kindly, ma'am, but I can't. And she went back downstairs. What did the mistress want? Said the servants. Well, actually, she invited me to the dance. Liar, they said, and they hit her on the head with skillets. Well, Baba C knows what a skillet is, but it's not a word that is used in the UK. So a skillet is like a cast iron frying pan. And the Baba C will tell me there's different versions. And I probably told this last time I was on because I can remember having this conversation with him. But I forget where I've told and what I've told. And they hit her on the head with skillets. Well, the next day, the same thing happened again, and again they called her a liar, and again they hit her on the head with skillets. Well, as you can understand, by this time she's getting a little bit upset. So by an enchantment, she put them all to sleep. She went upstairs, she put on her mossy petticoat, a dress of white satin, gold leaves on the size of a man's hand, and her silver slipper, and she whisked herself a dance. She danced all night with the mistress's son. Whenever she was asked where she came from, all she'd say was she came from a place where they hit her on the head with skillets. Well, at the end of the dance, she went out the corridor. She wished herself back to the big house. Once she woke up the servants. Whatever happened to us? They said, "Oh, you've been asleep." She said, "Oh, please don't tell the mistress." They said, "Do have this pair of stockings. Do have this bar of soap. Do have next week's wages." They were kind to her for 5 minutes, but the next day, when the same thing happened again they called her a liar, and again they hit her on the head with skillets. Well, the next day, the same thing happened again. And well, again, she was kind of, again, they hit her on the head with skillets. What comes of thinking about the next story when you're telling this, you kind of mix them up and they all get in a big mess in your head. Well, she went upstairs, she put on a dress of silk, the colour of the birds of the sky, and the silver slipper she wished herself at the dance. She danced all night with the mistress's son. Whenever she was asked where she came from, all she'd say was she came from a place where they hit her on the head with skillets. Well, at the end of the dance, she tried to get away, but he was one of those boys that held on too tight, just like an octopus. Got to forget this. And she just wished herself away from the middle of his arms, and as she disappeared, his hand must have just touched her foot, but one silver slipper fell off. Well, back at the big house, once more she woke up the servants, and one more they gave her the present so she wouldn't tell the mistress. But the mistress's son, he couldn't sleep. "Mum, I'm in love. Mum, I've got to find her. Mum, I can't stand it." "Neither can I," said Mum. "And if it will keep you quiet, we'll get all the girls of the land and we'll try the silver slipper on each of them." And they tried it on all, and it fitted none. And the only one who hadn't tried it on was Mossycoat. And of course, as soon as she tried it on, it fitted perfectly. He's about to take her in his arms. "Hold on," she said. She went upstairs and came down in a dress of silk, colour of the bird of the sky. He's about to take his arms again. "Hold on," she said. And she went upstairs, came down in a dress of silk, a dress of white satin, gold leaves on the size of a man's hand. This time he'd learned his lesson, and he asked her story, and she told him those parts she wanted him to hear, but she said nothing about being hit on the head with skillets. "The one thing I don't understand," he said, "you said you came from a place where they hit you on the head with skillets." Well, she said not a word. She just looked round at all the other servants, and the master, the mistress, and their son understood perfectly. And those servants were driven from the house by the dogs, and there were new servants employed, and there was a great wedding, and a great deal to eat, and even more to drink. And of course, had you been there, each and every one of you would have been invited. Why, Ben, story ends. Whoa. So, what am I going to do next? Well, I did decide in the middle of that story what the next story was going to be. I had prepared, as it was short notice, I didn't prepare this set at all. And if there wasn't a lot of clattering of plates, I'd be able to concentrate a lot better. Trouble is, when you're in other people's houses, you have to let them get on with their lives. And I am at the moment in other people's house. So I know what I'm going to go for Lapland. That should be far enough away so I can't hear the clattering in the kitchen. So I can't hear the clattering in the kitchen. And, so anyway, we'll go to the Lapland, and this is a Sami story, a story from the First Nation people who live there. And I mean, one thing I like most about Lapland is that it's still a surviving shamanic culture in Europe. People always think about First Nations being sort of Australia or North America or Canada, and there's in the very north of Europe, and of course a lot of our folklore has come down from there, because it went from there south to the Vikings and then across. But this is a story about the sun and the moon and northern lights. And there was the daughter of the moon. We'll call her Moon Girl. And the son of the sun, and we'll call him Moon Boy, the Sun Boy. And Moon Girl was beautiful. She had skin the color of cloudberries, with silver threads for her hair. And the sun looked at her and thought, "You're beautiful. You will be the person my son will marry." And he went to his son, he said, "Go and see Moon Girl. She will be your bride." Now, these days, most people aren't too happy if their parents choose their bride for them, or their partner, or even the husband. But actually, even way back then, but some boy did as his dad said, and to his surprise, his dad was right. She was the most beautiful creature. And he took off his golden shoes, his golden slippers, and passed them across to her. And she reached out and she took them. They burnt. She threw them back at him, ran back to her mother, and mother said, "Look, you've just turned down some boy, the son of the sun. I'm going to have to hide you. He's going to be really angry." And she went to a small island, and there was a cotter, a teepee, and she hid her. She hid her in the cotter and the goatee, and she made a flap of reindeer skin and pulled it over so the light couldn't shine out. And she lived there safely for quite a long time. Now, I've no means of knowing whether it was a year or 1,000 years, because when this story was first told, there was a completely different sense of time. But one day, Northern Lights came skipping across the sky with his brothers. And he looked down and he saw the goatee, and he said someone was inside. And he said, if you're older than me, you're my mother. If you're the same age as me, you're my sister. If you're younger than me, I will be your bride. You will be my bride. And he went down. He had one of those beautiful, playful voices. And they fell in love. And they were very happy, except that the trouble with playful boys is they will go out and play. And every night when his brothers came skipping across the sky, he'd leave them. But she was, he might have been playful, but she was wise. And while he was out one night, she made a carpeted roof, and she embroidered stars into them. So then he came in, he just went to sleep. When he woke up, he looked up, and there were the stars. And he thought he was already in the sky. And he didn't bother to go out. And so it was every night. Until one day, he'd gone out just for a walk, not skipping around the sky, but just stretch his legs. We all have to stretch our legs at times. But he hadn't put the flap back across the door of the teepee, of the goatee, of the cotter. Just as the moon was being pulled by the great bear across the night pool, and the sun was rising. And the sun looked and he saw the light of the moon girl pouring out of the cotton. And he went down, he grabbed her and pulled her out. And Northern Lights came running back and started beating on the sun, and the sun just threw him aside, and he was spun off into the universe. Moon girl was held by the sun, and he called this boy to him and he said, "This is your bride." And she said, "I hate you. I will never marry you." And the sun was so angry, he banished Moon Girl back to her mother. And occasionally, if you're very lucky, and if you're well in the north, you will look up and see the moon, and you will see the northern lights, and you'll see the girl in the moon peering longingly at northern lights, the northern lights peering longingly back. But their love must always be apart. So that was way north, way north. You could go down with a smile, going down south with a smile on my mouth, going down south with a smile on my mouth, going down south with a smile on my mouth. We'll go to Morocco. And, there's and this was a story I was given by Haj Ahmed, who's the granddaddy of Moroccan storytelling. He passed away, but Babassi met him at the first of the festivals. He was our honored guest. I'd met him a few years before with Zuhair, the other director of the festival. And I met him in Cafe Clock. And there was, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Babassi. And so I met him in Cafe Clock. And we sat, two old men in the corner, or two white-haired men in the corner. And then swapping stories. And I told him the story. I told him one of Duncan's stories about, which I'll tell first. I've never done them both together since that day, but Duncan Williamson, the Old Scots Traveller. And both the people I got these stories from are dead now. So, but there was a prince, one of the princes of Scotland, at the time of the ancient kings of Scotland. And he loved stories. Mainly because his mum came in every night, the Queen. And she'd sit by his bed and she'd tell him stories, which is something that mothers do now, and fathers. But before he'd go to sleep, she would tell him a story. He loved those stories. There'd be stories of princes and paupers, of princesses, princes, and fishermen, woodsmen, wise women from the forest, animals, and all those stories were helping to make him a better ruler. There were stories of humanity, there were stories of healing. But he wasn't worried about, as far as he was concerned, they were the beautiful stories from the mouth of his mother. Until one night, she just said goodnight and she walked out the door. Didn't tell him a story. And he said, "What's this about? He didn't tell me a story." He said, "Well, one day your father will be gone, I will be gone, and you will be king. And there'll be no one to tell you stories. You must start learning. I've given you what I could in the stories, teaching you how to be a wise and kind king. Now you'll have to work out the rest yourself. And he sort of accepted this. It made sense. His mother was wise, and she hadn't steered him wrong yet, but and true enough, sure enough, first his father died, then his mother died, and he was king. And he could have absolutely anything he wanted. If he wanted a string of horses, he could have a string of horses. If he wanted to build a castle, he could build a castle. Could have anything. But the one thing he wanted was stories. And he wanted someone to tell stories to him like his mother. And so he sent out a proclamation. Anyone who could tell stories as good as his mother could live at the palace with him, have a good life, be the king's official storyteller, and will be looked after. And probably be given a piece of gold each morning. And I'm told that Queen Elizabeth II's mother, Queen Mother, she didn't watch television, but there was a gypsy used to pass by, and he would be invited into the palace, and he would tell her stories. And then he'd be given a bed at the palace, and at his breakfast table the next day, there would be a half a crown, a silver coin, waiting for him. So it's not too far, even in modern days, even in the 20th century, royalty was still doing that. Well, the word went out, and everyone came to tell stories. Baba C popped in, and he did well, but not good enough. I went there, and I got out of my ear straight away. And most of the people that came to the cafe were, the world storytelling, and we got some great storytellers, and all the storytellers that are coming to our festival that tried, and they're fantastic. They are the most amazing storytellers, but none of them were as good as the king's mother. And he was just about to give up when the little gardener who tended the king's roses thought, well, everyone else has tried. Why don't I try? And he went timidly up to the door and knocked on the door, and the king called him in and said, well, what's wrong, little gardener? Is something wrong with my roses? Oh, no, Your Majesty, if it's not too much, I'd like to tell you a story. And he told the story. It was good. It was so good that the king told him to come back the next night. That one was even better. And he was told to come back the next night. And in the middle of that story, the king went fast asleep. Oh God, I was thinking my story was so bad. The king fell asleep in the middle of it. And he went running back to his little cottage, and he closed the locked the door. Well, the next day the guard came banging on his door. Little gardener, the king wants to see you. And he was dragged off to the king, and the king and the gardener said, I'm sorry, my story was so bad. I promise never to. I'll just look after roses. I'll never tell stories again. Said the king. Bad. It was wonderful. It was the first time I'd gone to sleep in a story since my mother told me stories, and every night she would tell me stories until I fell asleep. And you, little gardener, will do the same. And if you want, you can come and live in the palace, and you don't need to garden again. And the gardener said, to tell you the truth, Your Majesty, I like my little gardener's cottage, and I love tending my roses. But if it pleases you, I'll come and tell you stories every night. That's what happened. Well, that was the story I told Harsh. So Harsh gave me the story back, and we're just sitting in the corner of, I could get down lower then, and wasn't exactly cross-legged, but I was fairly low down, and we're both sitting in the corner. Zuhair, who's now director of the festival, was translating for us, me from English to Darija, and Harsh from Darija into English. And this is the one I was given. There was a king, and he loved stories. And he sent out a proclamation: whoever can tell stories to me can live in the palace, and they will be fed. And storytellers came from all over. I mean, we think we've got a lot of stories at the festival, storytellers at the festival, but that was nothing compared to the numbers that came to see that king. And they all told him stories. He was loving it and rolling around. There were stories he could cry to. There were stories he could laugh at. There were such stories. But the storytellers were told they could eat as much as they liked. And that is a really silly thing to tell storytellers. Because one day the king sent down for some food, and there was no food in the pantry for the king. And when he asked why, it was the storytellers that had eaten it all. He thought, well, I can't go back on my word. I can't just kick out all the storytellers. I'll have to, I'll just invent a new rule. Whoever can tell me a story without end can stay. But if anyone tries and fails, off with their head. Well, storytellers came and storytellers went. It was a bit like in the last story, because not all flies can make honey. Until one year, and they'd try and their heads were cut off, and there was heads dotted all around the parapet and the walls of the city on spikes. And the king began running out of storytellers. People were reluctant to come because if they failed to, people were still, some people bite off more than they can chew, and there were still people claiming they could tell a story without end, and they'd end up with their head in a spike. But till one day, a young man turned up, personable young man, good-looking young man. He said, "I'd like to try, Your Majesty." And King said, "Look, you're a nice-looking boy, You're obviously pleasant, and you're obviously kind, and you're obviously intelligent. Look at those heads on spikes. You wouldn't want to join them, would you? Do you still want to take up the challenge?" And the king said, "Yeah, I'll do it. I'll tell you a story with that end." And the king said, "Very well, start." And the young teller said, "Well, the king of the ants was out with his army, and it started raining, and they went and hid in a cave. And as their eyes became accustomed to the dark, they saw a mountain of wheat in front of them. And the king turned around to his 4 best soldier ants and said, 'Take a grain of this wheat, hold it up on your shoulders, and take it back to the anthill.' And they picked up a grain of that wheat, and they started back. Well, you wouldn't believe the adventures. They looked up, and there was a big bird flying overhead. And it was an omnivore, so it didn't mind eating insects and wheat. And there it was, its perfect meal, walking along the ground below it. And as the birds swooped down the ants hid under a piece of bark that was on the ground. And the bird, disappointed, flew off. And then it started raining so hard, they were washed down into a stream, but they managed to get on a leaf and float down the stream. And as the leaf was washed up on the shore, they carried on their journey, and all sorts of things happened. And I mean, it didn't took more than a day, more than a week, more than a month, but they eventually got that grain back to the anthill. And they went back to the king, the ants in the cave. And the king said, take this second grain of wheat, take it back to the anthill. And they had many adventures. Now, I've probably only got another 10 minutes to tell this story. And so it would take me 10 minutes to talk about those adventures. But let us just say it was exciting. And it took a month for them to get that back. And it took them only a week without the grain to go back to the cave. And they got back to the cave, and the king of the ants said, take this third grain of wheat, take it back to the ant. And the king said, hold on. How long does it take to get through this mountain of wheat? The storyteller said, about a year, your majesty. Well, come back to me in a year's time. Well, he came back in a year, and they said there was one more grain of wheat left, and that was taken back. And behind the grain of the mountain of wheat was a mountain of rice. And the king of the ants said, take this. And by the time they got to the third grain of rice, the king said, how long is it going to take to get through this mountain of rice? About a year, your majesty. We'll come back in a year. When he came back in a year, and behind the mountain of rice was a mountain of lentils. And the king said, look, we know what's going to happen. How long is it going to take to get round this mountain of lentils? About a year, your majesty. Come back in a year. Before I do that, said the storyteller, I want to marry your daughter. The king said, that's not fair. And the storyteller looked up, made the king look out the window at all the heads on the parapets. He said, do you think that was fair? The king said, you got a point. And the daughter quite liked the young man anyway, because he'd been around for a while. He kept coming back to the palace every year, and she quite looked forward to his return. And so they were married. But in that year, the king's daughter had a son. And when the storyteller came back to the king, stood before him, when the year had gone by, the king said, I think you've won, because it would hardly do for a grandfather to cut off the head of the father of his grandson. And the storyteller and the king's daughter and their son had their own palace and lived happily for the rest of their lives. So we've got, I don't know, maybe I haven't done monster poem for a long time on this. And I know Michael actually loves it. He's not here at the moment, but maybe. So just in case he watches it on catch up, he's probably exhausted from wearing his red suit, as I am. But yeah, we split the world between us. I do the southern hemisphere. He does the northern hemisphere. So this is a poem about monsters. Me and my friend Joey just thought just for a change that we'd go monster hunting on the monstrous mountain range. Joey said we'll need supplies. That's what I think. So we packed some peanut butter sandwiches and cans of fizzy drink. Well, Joey had a BMX and I had a mountain bike. We went as far as we could on those, and then we had to hike. We'd not gone far up the mountain when Joey called, "Look over there. It's the barbless, razorless monster. The one that's all covered in hair." We went a few steps closer. The monster let out a roar. "You can't scare us," said Joey. "That stuff doesn't work anymore." Then the excessively hairy monster with the enormous hairy head pulled us over to a rock, and this is what she said: "If you come monster hunting, then I'll put up a fight. I'll gnash my toes, gnash my teeth, and throw some stones and roar with all my might. But I suspect that's not your wish. You only want to know if monsters really do exist, and how tall do they grow, and are there many different sorts, and where do they all live?" Well, there's answers to your questions that I'm prepared to give, providing that you promise us you come with good intentions. After we've been around quite some time without your intervention. "No problem," answers Joey. "That is understood. Now, why don't you tell all your friends we're really very good and we don't want to upset them or ruin their routine by having them all this way for a monstrous display? You're the only one we've seen." Now, the excessively hairy monster put a finger each side of his teeth, let out one ear-piercing whistle that made the ground tremble beneath me and my friend Joey so much that even she looked perturbed. And then from each side of the mountain came the loudest noise we'd ever heard. And they came with a rumble and tumble, and they came with a squelch and a crunch, and they came with a huffing and puffing, and they came with a gobble and munch, and some of them had 6 heads, and some of them only had 2, and some of them were purple, and some were pink and blue, and some had hair on the palm of their hands, and one had hair on its nose, and one was as bald as the day it was born, and one of them seemed to glow. When they came up to the rock of the hairiest of them all, they were more than a little curious as to why on earth you call so many of the mountains monsters in the middle of the working day, and what could be the kind of game she invite them all to play. "I won't keep you long," she whispered, "but I've a sight that's really worth seeing. You might not have seen them around these parts before, but this is a human being. And there is another, though they're not fully grown. I think they're wondrously strange, and by far the most curious creatures to be found on this mountain range." Then Joey pulled out her sandwiches and offered them around. Without any fuss, the monsters and us sat down upon the ground. We had to agree as we munched at our lunch. Although mountains have their attractions, we'd best cycle home, leaving monsters alone, trying to work out our human reactions. Well, so, well, that's me for today. Next Friday, we have a real treat. Waleed, can you put this up in the schedule, please? And I will remind you, we've got the phenomenal, the amazing, the magnificent Bubba C from Washington, D.C., uh, telling stories for children. I shall see him about a week after that, or a couple of weeks after that, in Marrakesh itself. Meanwhile, have a great new year, everybody, and just stay safe, stay happy, smile a lot, do spontaneous acts of kindness, and look after yourself. Thank you, Waleed, for flying the magic carpet.
And thank you, John Rowe, for the excellent stories. Haj was an excellent person. We talked a bit too.
Yeah, it was great. Right now, I better give these people their house back. They can see you. Bye.
Take care.
Right. Right. No. Leave. It's never worked.
C out.